Okay, I'd like to welcome everybody to our speaker series for the FANHS Museum. And today we have Leatrice Perez. Her family has been in the Stockton area for almost 100 years. And so she is one of the go-to authorities to go to for the history of Filipinos in the Stockton area. Her family and herself were connected with the Filipino community for all these years. And so she's got a few things to tell us today. And she created a PowerPoint exhibit, which I hope everybody can see. And she's going to be talking about a couple of articles that she found in a magazine that none of us have ever had access to it. And so it's a good thing that she's got it. So she's going to tell us a little bit about herself, and then she will go on with her exhibit presentation. Thank you, everybody, for being here. Okay, Letty, it's all yours.
Oh, wow. Well, I hope you are going to find this interesting. It's a bit of trivia from the past and especially during World War II. And some of these people that I'm going to mention were prominent people within the community from the East Coast to the Pacific. And especially, I want to introduce to you. All right, this is Dr. Diosdado Yap. He was well known in the Philippines as well as here. And if you notice the book he's holding, it says Know Your Congress. Now, Diosdado Yap, in the meantime, during World War II, especially in the 40s, he published and edited and wrote a magazine called Bataan. I used to say Bataan, but I have a Philippine caregiver who said, no, you say Bataan. So anyway, I don't know how you would pronounce it. But he put out this magazine, and he had journalists, Filipino-American journalists from all across the nation, from New York, Washington to the Pacific Coast, all the way up and down California up to Seattle, Washington. And they would write articles for him of the Filipino communities and also all the prominent people that they do within the Filipino community, as well as during that time, our military, outstanding military people. So after the war, this is when Dr. Yap put out this magazine called Know Your Congress. He has a copyright for this, which he publishes all the senators and congressmen within Washington who are our leaders in our cities and counties, etc. So if anybody wanted to know anything about a senator or a congressman, you would go to his book. And he was publishing this for years. I have a few copies of it, but I couldn't find one right now. So next.
Auntie Letty, on the Bataan magazine,
Yeah.
is that also the same Bataan newspaper that was done in the 60s?
No.
Okay.
No, this was a particular, I'm sorry I didn't make a copy of the cover, but it's different, I believe. Yeah, because in the 60s, I don't think he was publishing it then. But I'm just giving you a little trivia also about the Filipino community. This is a picture of a lot of the businessmen and journalists who welcomed in the middle here. I don't know, I can't move my arrow, can I? This is Senator Garcia. He eventually became president of the Philippines. And next to him was another senator, I think Pedro Lopez. But you'll find interesting here are the community leaders, people who were prominent at that time in the community. Mr. Enty, this is his backyard. This is Mr. Enty, the one lying in the middle. Can you see this? And Dr. Yap is sitting next to him.
Anthony's dad's in that picture.
Yes, he's on the right.
Yes.
Mr. Nkobo. He was one of the prominent businessmen of Stockton.
Where is he located? Is he in the front?
He's sitting down on on the right hand side in front of the soldier.
Oh, okay.
There.
Wow.
Next to him at the back is Mr. Roldan, who is the Stockton Filipino newspaper man. Whenever there was an occasion, you would find Mr. Roldan there distributing his newspapers. And the interesting thing about him was if he didn't have someone write an article, he would republish one issue, even though they were republished. And
That's Uncle Frank right there.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
why are you republishing it? And he said, well, the advertisers don't know I republished. They don't read it. They only put their ads in. So when he didn't have enough news or writing, he would republish an issue. But here, these were prominent. At the top back, the tallest man at the back is Dr. Bautista.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. And then all the other businessmen. In fact, my sister's first boss is 1, 2, 3, 4. Fourth from the left, standing, was Mr. Gonzalez. He had the first Filipino ice cream parlor. And Angel was the soda jerk.
Don't forget to say about Uncle Frank right there with his tie that's hanging out on the top standing.
Is that the first one on the left there?
Yeah, right there where the cursor is.
The soldier and the third man from the second man from the soldier.
Yes.
Okay, from the right. Okay.
That was before I knew he would be my husband.
Wow.
By the way, for humor, he was Uncle Frank. And when my sons asked me who's Uncle Frank, they were looking at a book that he gave to me that was on Shakespeare. And he said, Letty, I hope you will memorize some of these words of Shakespeare and enjoy it. And then he signed it Uncle Frank. So my boys are in high school now. And they said, Mom, who's Uncle Frank? I said, it's your dad. Will you marry your uncle?
My dad.
Yeah, so in the
Okay.
corner down bottom.
Yeah, okay.
Okay, next.
Oops.
The next one. All right. This is a bit of story by Carlos Bulosan himself. This is part of his biography. And I thought it was interesting because this is where he says he was being educated as a Filipino writer. And when he wrote this, he said that he had come to America when he was 15 years old. And he wanted to see what he had not seen in the Philippines. I did not know how I would appreciate America. I only knew that there would be a common denominator which every immigrant or Native American should look for in order to understand her and be of service to her people. I did not know that I was coming closer to American reality. He wrote how the first few years he followed the crops from California, starting in apple orchards in Sunnyvale to Oregon and into Washington. And he said, I worked all my life on the farms in the Philippines. And now I find myself doing the same thing here in America. he began to see himself. If this was the real America, why had I come? I believed in the other men who came before me and stayed to discover America. It took him almost a decade before he got a glimpse of the real America. It was now the Great Depression, and he was part of 16 million unemployed. I saw the rich flatlands from a passing freight train, or from the back of a truck. So at that time, he was traveling from Southern Cal and even Arizona all the way up to Washington by freight train. So he was saying that this is how he traveled in those first few years that he was here in America. And for the 2 years of cold wintry days, he then began to find refuge in the public libraries. At night, about 5 o'clock, he would leave the library and go to the gambling houses, because there is where he would get a free meal, because at least you could get one free meal if you attended the gambling house. So he then said that a few years later, he got sick. And he was sick for 2 years in a hospital, dying. He thought he was dying, but he was determined not to die. So he survived the illness. He said he got the illness from having been gotten sick. He said the disease was from years of hunger and depression, but he survived because he was determined to show that he could survive America.
Auntie Letty, did you know Carlos Bulosan?
We met him a few times. Frank was a friend of his, and he would, Carlos would come up to Stockton. And at that time, Frank was with a newspaper magazine that was starting, and a magazine and a newspaper. They called Frank up from Los Angeles. These two Filipinos, Llamas Rosario and Jose de los Reyes, and said, we're starting a magazine and newspaper. If you will come up, and we can't pay you, but there is work here. Because Frank had left during the war. He lost his job at Santa Monica Douglas Aircraft Corporation, where he worked during the war. And he left for other reasons, personal reasons. So when he came, Carlos would come up sometimes from Los Angeles, and he had no place to stay. So he would stay in the back room of their office, and they had a cot bed. And he would sit there in the office and write his stories or his articles. But that's where he slept, on that cot bed in the back. And he always had a big gallon of claret wine, because he could not write unless he was drinking, so to say. By the way, when he was traveling by freight car, it is said that he jumped off the moving freight train in a town he wanted to stay, and that's when he broke his leg. So he walked with a limp, and it was because of his traveling by train and jumping off of it.
Auntie Letty, one last question on Carlos Bulosan.
Yes.
Was he what was he like? Was he a very positive man? Was he a very
Well, we didn't associate with him much, except having met him when Frank brought him to the house to meet our family. But he wasn't known then. You know, he didn't get to be known till during the war or just after that his book became popular because he was the first Filipino writer that was known, especially when he wrote that Freedom from Want for the Saturday Evening Post. That's when he first got his name up in front. But other than that, we had no real personal social time with him. Frank did. But he would say that he was a poor writer because he really didn't, he worked once in a while on the farms only to be able to get enough money to survive for a short time. But most of the time he was writing, you know, he didn't work and he relied on all his friends wherever he stayed. But that's all I know about him. But
Thank you.
he didn't come to be known until much later, especially during the time that they started having ethnic studies in the schools, because then they were looking for Filipino writers or prominent Filipinos that they could present in their studies. And that's how Bulosan got to be known. But prior to that, he wasn't well known. The first writings were at that time the Saturday Evening Post that made him popular. When I want to end with after he got sick, he did have an audience with President Quezon at one time. And that was when President Quezon was here during the war. They found refuge here in America. And he was asked to see President Quezon because they heard about his writings at that time. And he asked Carlos to write his biography of President Quezon. But Quezon was already dying. And so he describes how he entered the room where President Quezon could hardly speak, but his message to him was he wanted him to start writing about his life. Well, he said, Bulosan said he was starting to write one morning, and just as he touched his typewriter, he got a phone call. And the phone call said that President Quezon died. He said that he was paralyzed. He couldn't move. He thought, oh my goodness, I just spoke to him a few days ago and ready to do what he asked me to, and I couldn't do it. He said at that moment, I was paralyzed. So I don't think Bulosan ever got to write that biography of Quezon. But he describes that very clearly. And the last I want to just say that at the end here, he wrote in his diary, "It is well that we in America take nourishment from a common spring. The four freedoms may not be realized in our time, but if the war against fascism ends, we may be sure that we have been motivated by a native force dynamic enough to give form to the creative spirit in America. Now I believe that all of us in America must be bound together by a common faith and work towards the goal." And that was the end of his article. I mean, that's all I can say about Bulosan right now. I'm sorry I lost part of my writing on it. Okay, we can go next. This is part of a picture of when Colonel Romulo was welcomed in Delano, or he was honored like a returning hero. So this is a group of people in Delano. So I don't know, Erwin, how old you were in 1940s?
Oh,
You
I was a glimmer in my parents' eyes.
weren't
Uh,
born yet.
And I wasn't born yet, but you know that photo, it looks extremely like the old Veterans of Foreign War building
Yeah.
that has
Colonel
since.
Romulo, you know, Colonel Romulo was standing right behind the flowers, behind the children. So he's in the middle of there. Now, these people are not just from Delano. They're from all over California, probably. Southern Cal. A lot of newspaper men. So let's go back a little bit. Now, when Colonel Romulo was in Delano, he gave speeches to 16 cities, starting in San Francisco all the way down the peninsula and down to even Arizona, Phoenix, Arizona. And then he hit all the farm countries, Exeter, Raleigh. These are small country towns. And one of the things that Romulo did, which the people really felt honored and praised him for, was that he did not just sit with the elite or the prominent leaders of the towns, but he did sit with the farm laborer. He dined with them. And one of the things he did that I thought was interesting was that he spoke to the people in their dialect. He could speak not just Tagalog, Binalon, Ilocano, Visayan, and this is what the farm laborers appreciated of him. But he was humble and very appreciative of the farm workers. So now he was asked to speak at a Rotary Club in Delano. The schools, the grammar school, the high school, excused their children to go listen to Romulo speak. And so here he says, to you, my brother Americans, I commend my countrymen in your midst. Take them as your own. Take them into your hearts, as the 17 million Filipinos took into their hearts the 7,000 American soldiers who fought for you, for us, for freedom in Bataan. Don't discriminate against them, please. Smile at them when you meet them in your street. Thus, in ringing tones, did Colonel Carlos Romulo plead for tolerance for the Filipinos on the Pacific coast during his brainstorming tour of 13 California cities, starting from San Francisco on April 7 and ended in Phoenix, Arizona on April 21. It was an impassioned plea, and it has endeared this dynamic official of the Philippine government to his countrymen on the West Coast, who have long suffered the pains and tortures of racial discrimination. This article was written by John C. Dionisio. Dionisio was a graduate of university in Seattle. I forget whether it was Gonzaga or the university itself. But he moved down here to Stockton. And I'm sorry, I'm deviating a little bit. But this article was written by him. Dionisio was the public relations officer for the first union organized by the Filipinos during the asparagus strike. And he lived across the street from the headquarters of the union at that time. It was called FALA, Filipino Agricultural Labor Association. And Dionisio was one of the journalists for Dr. Yap, for the Pacific Coast especially. He was head of the bureau for the Bataan magazine. And so then later on, after the war, Mr. Junicio became hired by the Philippine consulate, or the Philippine government, actually. And as a consul, he then was eventually promoted to, I think, as ambassador or prime minister to Jakarta. So he held very high positions within the Philippine government. And when he retired to Hawaii and started his own newspaper. So his wife and child that at that time was Patricia. His wife was Anna, and they attended our church. They lived across the street from the church. So we got to know Mr. Junicio very well. He was a very prominent person within the community. So when he wrote this article, it was because he had attended all the conferences of Colonel Romulo. You notice I'm calling him Colonel. That came. So when he gave this speech, he gave it to the children as well as to the Rotary Club, and all these Americans were inviting him to be their speaker. And one article writes that it was only Colonel Romulo who would speak to the American population and the American senators, congressmen in this fashion. By one newspaper wrote that when Romulo spoke, he spoke like a tornado with force. He didn't mince his words. He called it like it was. And when he was in San Francisco, by the way, he was also the charter member of the United Nations. And he had asked for all these Filipino journalists to come and meet with him because he wanted to feel and know the climate of the Filipino communities throughout America. So these newspaper men met in San Francisco with him and personally would give him information regarding all the Filipino communities where they were where they lived or represented. From this speech, the children were very impressed, and the picture that shows him, the next picture, please. This picture shows him speaking at Mare Island, and there were Colonel Romulo with Rear Admiral Malan Tisdale. He was the commander of the Navy Yard at Mare Island in Vallejo. He took this occasion of Colonel Romulo's address to 42,000 Navy Yard workers, and among those workers were 600 Filipinos. Next picture. Next. Okay, that's the Delano. That's where he spoke. And then this shows a picture of all the newspaper, Filipino papers that printed here about him. Romulo wins West Coast Filipinos. He asked for tolerance. And as you see, he was a very popular man at that time. Next. Now, this is the picture after MacArthur said at Corregidor that when they were leaving Corregidor, he would return. Can that picture be moved a little to the left? Well, this is a picture of President Bustamante. You see him on the left, General MacArthur in the middle, and on the right would be Carlos Romulo. This is when they were about to land on Leyte, when they were returning to the Philippines because from Australia, because they were, MacArthur had promised he would be returning. And so the next picture. Next. There they are at the landing in Leyte, Paulo Leyte, the Red Beach. Now, you see MacArthur in the middle, Osmeña is far left, and on the far right, the short man is General Romulo. Now, behind MacArthur is another man who was the one that carried the carbines for MacArthur, one for himself and one for MacArthur. He also carried whatever briefcase or books that MacArthur had with him. Next picture. The humor, even during the war. Notice the sign? Reno, 81,000 miles, 8,100 miles. Or I think they use kilometers. Oh, it says miles. Tony's Tuba Tavern. Chicago, the Stork Club. So there they had put up signs there on the Leyte Beach of how far it is from Tacloban to America. Okay, next. Now, this is a little writing about Romulo and MacArthur. When MacArthur left Corregidor 2.5 years ago for Australia, one of them left with him and had been with him all the time was, of course, Colonel Romulo. He was always with MacArthur wherever he went. So towards the bottom here, it says that he served as major in the Philippines. He started as a colonel, and he was inducted into the United States Army as a major 10 days after the attack at Pearl Harbor. In Bataan, he was promoted to lieutenant colonel and then to colonel, and was awarded the Purple Heart, Silver Star, and Oak Leaf Cluster. On August 1st, 1942, he was made aide-de-camp to General MacArthur, who twice had cited him in the Bataan campaign. Since he left Australia, he has been promoted to Brigadier General. Unless death or incapacity should separate them, it is safe to say that MacArthur and Romulo will be together when the Stars and Stripes are flown over the last Japanese garrison on the islands. And that was written at the Charlotte Observer, I believe Charlotte, North Carolina newspaper. Next. This is showing Romulo in retirement. This picture was taken by Minerva Amistoso. And the next. By the way, that picture does show him trying to teach his dog how to sing. That's his retirement. Okay. This is the aide-de-camp that carried the Arbine behind MacArthur. Shows him in retirement also. He was MacArthur's personal aide. Next. Okay. Now, any questions on Romulo? I was going to say more, but I think time is going. This is part of a little human personal story that I wanted to tell you about. This is General Vicente Lim. His army was the one that was in the Philippines, defending the Philippines, and the Japanese were looking for him. And it was the guerrillas in the Philippines who hid Vicente Lim and his men. Next. why I say this is a personal story is because it's personal to me. And this is the wife of General Lim, Pilar Lim. And you can't move that picture. Well, I was going to say, there was an office in San Francisco called Office of War Information. And this man, Mr. Ryan, was assigned to the radio station to deliver news of the war that was going on at that time. And he was the producer, the programmer, everything. When he was first, oh, there you go. He was the one that, anyway, published all the information regarding the war through the radio to the men in the front in the war. And he also had a woman named Carmen Ligaya, and she was the counterpoint of Tokyo Rose. So she was our Tokyo Rose. And you know who Tokyo Rose was? She was the Japanese woman who delivered messages to our men in the war and trying to make them homesick and delivering propaganda by radio, etc. So Carmen Ligaya was hired at the radio station in San Francisco. And so she would play records for our troops to counter anything that Tokyo Rose said. And Mr. Ryan at that time was also wanting to get news at the front. But he then decided that he would contact Pilar Lim, who was in Los Angeles at the time. And so he contacted her and asked her if she would say a few words on the radio to her husband, hopefully that they would hear it on their radio that they had in the jungle. And so Mrs. Lim made a beautiful greeting to her husband, praying all the while that he would hear. And then she called, after she spoke, she called her son, her little boy who was 7 at the time, and asked him to say something to his father. And the little boy said, Mother, he said, I cannot say anything, but I can say a prayer. So he said the prayer that he learned at his father's knee. Now, they didn't know whether or not the father and his men would ever hear this. But later, months later, Ryan wondered about that. And then one day, he heard the good news. The general and his men had heard the program over a shortwave radio as the Japanese bombs were flying around them and dropping on them. The general then said that the troops heard the little boy's prayer and they wept. The reason I was telling this story is because I got to meet Mrs. Lim. If you see in the picture to the right, the first woman on the left is Mrs. Estela Sulit, who was a consul at the Philippine consulate in San Francisco. Next to her, the tall woman, is Mrs. Rita Villaruz, Art Villaruz's mother. And then my mother is the short lady. Now, this was taken on the occasion of when they met. Mrs. Lim was invited by the Stockton Filipino community to be a guest speaker at a big banquet they gave in her honor. the interesting thing was that Mrs. Lim and my mother were classmates at the Colegio de Mujeres in Manila when they were young college girls. They were roommates, classmates. And Mrs. Lim was so happy to meet my mother again after all these years. And she said, I want to stay at your home tonight and catch up. So my mother said, all right. So I remember the two when Mrs. Lim came and they had the front bedroom. And we could hear them talking and laughing and giggling like little schoolgirls. The next morning she left for San Francisco. A car came and picked her up. But of course, the leaders of the Filipino community were not happy that she stayed overnight with my mom. That's the end of my story. Any questions? I'm sorry, I just had to tell you that. But
Auntie Letty, question.
I didn't hear you.
Your mom and Pilar Lim, what university did they go to in the Philippines?
Mujeres, Colegio de Mujeres, which is the women's college in Manila. I believe someone told me. But in the 1912, what she was 20, 19. I wish I had a copy of the Bataan magazine. Can I show it somehow on here?
Well, you
can-
can hold it
can-
up.
I can hold it up.
If you hold it up to your camera on your machine, just hold it up in front of you. I think we can see.
Oh, if you see me, there you go.
Yeah, yeah.
There's the magazine.
Okay, we can see the masthead.
Okay, that's it.
Yeah.
Well, that was 1945. So he
Okay.
was printing these. I have copies of 1944, 45, I think 43. But after the war, I didn't see any more of these. So I think he then concentrated on Know His Congress. And thank you all for attending. I hope you found it interesting.
Oh, yeah. Well, thank you, everybody, for attending. And, you know, we hope that you look forward to our next museum speaker.
Yeah.
We're going to try and plan something for every month, you know, so we can get back on track.